Sarah Nuttall, and I'm the director of WiSER. And a particular welcome to Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, the person of the night, here to launch his book, The New Apartheid. Actually, more like, person of the month, Sizwe, given the way that this book is taking flight. Sizwe holds a PhD in international relations from Oxford University and is about to launch a career in that field. And he's also a postdoctoral fellow at WiSER and plays an important role at the Institute, both in terms of his scholarship and his public humanities work on numerous fronts. Since we're a large institute, we naturally attract and actively encourage multiple points of view on numerous topics, as many of you who attend our events will know, as well as intergenerational arguments, entanglements, consensus, critique. Sizwe, it's been a joy to see you navigate these very animated and challenging waters in the spirit that you have through your commitment to writing within an academic terrain for a wide audience, in the tradition perhaps of what we could term academic nonfiction, certainly with this book and your previous book. I've seen you over several years arguing your case forcefully in our seminar rooms, taking constructive criticisms on the chin, shifting gear when you decide to, committing to comparative lenses in thinking about South Africa now, asserting the work of generational critique, and coming to the point of sustained and singular intervention as you do in this book. What do we need to take with us into a new era? You ask everyone, but again with a generational inflection, given that this will be your inheritance, as you put it, implicitly, if not explicitly, and politically speaking. And what do we need to discard? A question which interests you a great deal. How, you ask, could we think about our political structures, our legislature, the powers we grant our president, our voting system, aspects of our constitution differently? How could we reinvent the largely derailed, in your view, and many people's views, of course, experiment that was 1994? And how is the new apartheid, as you seek to term it, being deracialized, and what are the consequences of that? In your conversation with Dr. Mbembe about a week ago, you put it thus: how can we create something more just than our current republic of stagnation? That stood out for her, and it stood out for me listening to you. The force of that question and the anticipation of your sustained answer to it. It's a question that we are bound to ask collectively and creatively, even if, and especially perhaps when we disagree about how to answer it. What is wanted, what you call for, is a debate that lives, that animates us now. And that, Sizwe, you have already, given the events of the last week or so. I'd like to very warmly welcome Dr. Mpho Matsipa from WiSER, Jessica Breakey, also from WiSER, and Rekgotsofetse Chikane from the School of Governance at Wits, as Sizwe's respondents this evening. Closing comments before we open to questions will be from Achille and Mbembe, also at WiSER. Before I hand over to Sizwe, who will talk to his book for about 15 minutes, may I ask that you ask your questions and offer your comments in the chat as we go along. We're going to ask speakers to pick up on those and really run with aspects that they'd like to address. And please signal if you'd like to ask your question in person. I'm also going to ask the speakers to pass the baton to each other rather than coming back through the chair. So when Sizwe has spoken to the book, he'll pass on to Mpho and so on. So Sizwe, over to you to make your opening comments. We so appreciate your presence at WiSER and really looking forward to this session. Sizwe.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today. I see we have quite a decent audience at 120 people. So thank you to everyone who's taken their time for this conversation, for which I cannot wait. I think we couldn't have a more erudite and fascinating panel of respondents for this work across multiple generations and disciplines. But I'd particularly like to begin with acknowledgements before I get into some of the more substantive comments about the work, its ambitions, and some of its limitations. And I might add, because of the way that the work has in many ways taken on a life of its own in the last week, what the work is not about. But before I get on to some of those more substantive comments, I'd just like to first pay tribute to WiSER, because this is very much a project of WiSER, a project which comes out of the scholarly engagements which I've had at WiSER, and particularly Sarah, who has been a rare combination of personal support and intellectual inspiration, and Achille, who's played a similar role. I say in the acknowledgements of this book that this is a work which lives in the shadow of the considerable collective genius of the Nuttall Mbembe household. So I'd just like to thank you very much for the role you've both played in this work. It's deeply appreciated. And the patience which WiSER has shown as I worked through bringing this work to fruition. And also to all colleagues at WiSER, thank you so much for your contributions to this work. You are all voluminously cited when you do get a chance to read it, and you are also duly acknowledged. And so I'd like to thank you all. And just continuing in this vein and coming closer to the book itself, just to start with a story of how this work came about. One of the key moments in this work was a seminar at WiSER where I foolishly presented the early makings of this work to a panel of luminaries. And in that crucible, I was directed in multiple different directions through multiple different works and in multiple different disciplines. And as I hit the considerable intellectual brick wall of WiSER's seminar room, I was able to transcend my early ideas and really take this work on to a new level with the comments and the critique that I got in mid 2019 now. And so this work really comes out of an initial idea bounced off against colleagues at WiSER and then trekking into various different critiques, responding to them, sometimes defending my original idea against them, and sometimes realizing its limitations. And so the seminar room and the digital seminar room have been seminal to this work. And so I profoundly thank and acknowledge WiSER for playing a role in bringing this work to fruition. Having said that, I'd like to talk about the book from 3 different vantage points this evening. First, to speak about the aims of this work, and I'm very excited to be speaking to a scholarly audience because I haven't been able to delve yet into some of the scholarly ambitions of this work. And so I'd like to speak about what I'm trying to do as a scholar, even though this book is also pitched to a public audience. And so I'll speak about the ambitions of the work and how those have evolved to the final form of this book. Having traced some of those aims, I'll then take you through the structure of the book. I'm mindful that this work is still very new, and so many of the people watching won't have had a chance to read it yet. And so I'd like to give you a flavor for the work, give you a deeper insight into how the argument unfolds and develops. And I'll read from different parts of the book so that you can get a sense of the work itself. And then, having looked at the structure and some of the aims of the work, I'll end by just entering a few caveats and ensuring that some of the qualifications that I make in the book about what the work is about and isn't about are made clear. And I think that will help our discussion. And again, I look greatly forward to responses. I'd just like to thank, before I begin, again, Jessica, Mpho, and Rekgotsofetse, who I haven't yet acknowledged, for being part of this panel. Thank you very much for giving your time to this project and for being part of this. When we come to the ambitions of this work, I've had a nagging sense for a very long time that the Apartheid project has seeded itself deeply within the democratic project. And I've often heard that lament. I think that lament, particularly in scholarly circles, but just in South Africa's general public discourse, that lament is quite common, that we haven't grappled with apartheid to the extent that we thought we did in the celebratory epoch of the 1990s and the constitutional transition. But it's one thing to appreciate that sentiment. I think it's quite another to delve into that sentiment in full depth at book length and see where one comes out at the end. And that's really what I tried to do in this book, is take a long-held view that apartheid has become omnipresent in the democratic moment, even as it has become invisible, and explore that in all its depth and see to what extent that idea holds and to what extent it doesn't. And that's really the ambition of the book, is to pursue that long-held hunch, if you will. And I ultimately do try to defend some version of the argument that, as I put it, apartheid did not die, it was privatized. And that statement, which underpins the work and around which the work revolves, is really an attempt to describe how, on the one hand, much has changed, but on the other hand, so much has remained the same. So that's really what the work aims to do. But in doing that and in attacking that problem, I ran into a number of interesting intellectual conundrums around which I had to wriggle. And this had to do with temporality in the work, because I realized very quickly that as soon as one embarks on an attempt to compare the past with the present, one is both doing some historical work, but one is also doing work to try and dig through the current conjuncture. And then one is actually also implicitly, but then even explicitly in the conclusion of this work, thinking through alternative futures. And so what I tried to do in this work is bring these different temporalities into conversation in this particular moment. And I think this is a particularly ripe moment, both to return to apartheid and to think back to it and to remind ourselves of it, but also to think forward and to try and question, but then also transcend the impasse at which we seem to be finding ourselves. So throughout the work, there are reflections on past, present, and future interwoven at different moments. And so you'll find a deep analysis on what apartheid actually is, which, to my great surprise, is a much more complex question than I had initially realized. And so in trying to trace the afterlives of apartheid, I realized that we don't have a very clear handle on apartheid as a political philosophy, as a concept, and we have in many ways limited our conception as we have stylized apartheid as a purely historical moment. And so untangling apartheid as an idea turned out to be a much more difficult intellectual exercise, and you'll see me grappling with the idea at different parts of the work. And so that's a key ambition, is in addition to looking at these different temporalities, there's a certain archaeological impulse to disentomb and to excavate and to exhume and to look at the horrid thing and really try to take it in again. And in doing that, there is, of course, then the question of the future, which was a question that I continued to try to avoid, because the last thing I wanted to do with this work was to make it a kind of commentary on current affairs or a shopping list or a laundry list of quick fixes. What I wanted to do was diagnose a crisis and reframe a crisis. But inevitably, that continued to lead me to the question of new futures. And that was something that I was provoked to do very early on by Sarah. And the question of the future kept intruding in on the work. And so in the conclusion, what the work tries to do is say, well, once we have comprehended the monumental scale of apartheid in the present, then it's incumbent on us to bring an equal sense of scale to our imagination of the future, and to avoid limiting our options to the options which have thus far been presented. So that's really what the work aims to do. And again, in a talk of this length, I can only just grasp at some of the nuances in the argument. And as you read the book, you'll see me grappling with these questions at length and in depth. But ultimately, I think the time has come to re-theorize where we are, and to break free of some of the old lenses, and to do the hard work of building the new lenses, given our particularly useful vantage point of 3 decades onwards from the pantomimic democratic passage, as I call it. So that's a little bit about what the work aims to do. But let me also try to give you a flavor of the work and come to some of the questions of structure. So the book opens with 3 epigraphs, and I'll read the one that comes from Sarah, actually, because I think it encapsulates part of what's happening here. And so this is how the book opens, with one quotation of 3, which is that, and I quote, "The question of when an epoch begins and when it can be deemed closed is always open to a multiplicity of responses. The velocity and unexpectedness of the social is such that naming it often comes afterwards, after the fact." And after that, we get into an introduction, which really tries to put forth the argument, define key terms, and enter various qualifications. And I'll come back to those qualifications, as I said, towards the end of this exploration. But what I thought I would do is just give you a sense of that section. And so in that introduction, what I say is that in this book, I confront apartheid's imminence and eminence in South Africa's present. I trace apartheid's inequities and iniquities beyond 1994. To do this is to suggest that apartheid is more than just a legacy, effigy, or reverberating echo. It is to excavate and disentomb apartheid. It is to search beyond the pomp and pantomime of South Africa's democratic passage into what the poet Lebo Mashile calls the existential crisis of a miracle overstretched. And then after the introduction, there are 5 chapters which try to explore the idea in 5 different realms of South African life. So it begins with a reflection on space and the preservation of apartheid in spatial relations. It then moves on to the question of law, where I explore the extent to which South Africa's legal system, including its constitution, is capable of surmounting the crisis of the new apartheid. Then it moves on to the question of wealth, and this is where I try to trace the transmutation of wealth since 1994. And I look at how wealth has changed in so many fundamental ways, but often traces back to very similar origins to apartheid wealth structures, in addition, of course, to its globalization. And those 2 things aren't necessarily different. And then there's a chapter on technology, where I look at the confluence of the South African democratic constitutional transition and the rise of personal computing and digital technologies, and inquire into how those 2 processes speak to one another, but also how digital processes of social categorization reinforce patterns of apartheid and the new apartheid in the present, and suggest that various forms of social categorization in the present are enough to make Verwoerd blush. And then finally, in the conclusion, I try to search towards a different future, and I call for at least a debate on a new democratic republic. And so what I try to do is disrupt this end of history narrative that we've built for ourselves, and suggest that we may rather be living in a more transitory moment in a first democratic republic, where the lessons of this experiment can be learned and taken through into a second democratic republic, which builds on important aspects of the Constitution, but also transcends some of its limitations, which I highlight. And so eventually, what I try to end the book on is a provocation, which is to urge us to try and think beyond the limitations of this moment and this democratic republic, and perhaps think about how we might consolidate this democracy's gains while also seeking to go beyond it and searching beyond it. If I could just close then by reflecting on some qualifications, because I appreciate that the work has a catchy title, which is a no-no in academia often, and there's a sense in which this work might be seen as a gimmick if one hasn't engaged with the research and the argumentation. And I just want to be very clear about what I'm not saying with this book and why I'm invoking apartheid. And so I'd like to do that by reflecting on what I actually say in the book about that, because I'm well aware that apartheid is more than just a feeling of racial unease or even deep-seated racism. And as I say, I grapple quite deeply with the word in the book. And so what I say is, in 1994, since 1994, the term apartheid has suffered from ceaseless reattribution. Stripped of nuance and denuded of intricacy, the word has increasingly come to sound like old music. Either the A word is invoked to promote panic or to stir passion without regard to its painful history, or it connotes cliched nostalgia, and here I quote, from sepia-toned representations of the past and airbrushed memories of Mandela to, and I quote again, drum magazine imagery as hip couture and the romanticized recuperation of the penny whistle. In both cases, apartheid is used liberally, widely, and unhelpfully. Ironically then, when apartheid died, the term was reborn, shedding much of its conceptual gravity. And I try to bring that conceptual gravity back to the term with a deep engagement with it. And then finally, just to say that what I'm not arguing is that where we find ourselves now is the exact same position that we found ourselves in 94 or even before 1994. The reason the work is called The New Apartheid is because there is something new about this moment, even as the old creeps into the moment at the same time. And so what I say is, quote, two competing and intertwining visions clash in South Africa today. One, a democratic egalitarian vision called the New South Africa. The other, an oppressive and conservative vision hidden in plain sight that I call the New Apartheid. These clashing but entangled projects produce a society in contradiction, undergoing at once extraordinary change and frustrating stagnancy. So I acknowledge the very important gains that have been made since 1994. I don't dismiss the extension of the franchise to people above the age of 18. But what I do try to do is say that the over-dramatization of that moment is actually causing an infinity of troubles in preventing us and blinkering us from seeing some of the continuities and the resemblances between this moment and the formal apartheid past. There's so much more I wish I could explore, and I hope you'll find much more in the book and in the work. There are various provocations, and my latest hope is that the book will be banned, because that's all that's left. I haven't yet achieved that, but hopefully tonight we can get one step closer. And thank you very much again for engaging. I look forward to your questions, your engagements, your critiques, and also hope we can keep the conversation going on social media, where there's been a very lively debate on the hashtag #TheNewApartheid. So hope we can also meet there. Thanks. And I'll hand over to Mpho.
Thank you, Sizwe. First of all, I just wanted, can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, I just wanted to say congratulations on the book. And I'm so happy that it is in the world. I think it's a very necessary intervention, given the aura of sort of collective amnesia that we've all been pushed into over the last few decades. There are a number of things that really struck me, and I'm going to limit my comments to your discussion around space. But there were two lines, one in the introduction, mainly in the introduction, that really stood out for me. The first was one that you mentioned already, which was that apartheid is more than just a feeling of racial unease. And I think that ties in very closely to this idea of apartheid amnesia, right? That there is this A word that people don't feel comfortable talking about, and it just makes us feel like it's going to reproduce a set of discourses that belong firmly in the past. So I think that this is a very necessary insistence on rupturing this binary structure of before and after, or apartheid and post-apartheid, to signal the continuities. And that brings me to the second line that you offered on page 20, which is that apartheid's geography survives. And I think that this speaks very deeply to the ways, based on my own observations as an urbanist, on the ways in which neoliberal landscapes and apartheid map onto each other so easily, so comfortably. And I think that that's part of the conceptual work that's really interesting, that this particular chapter on space offers, or opens an avenue into, that by thinking through apartheid conceptually, we can actually bring a much deeper understanding to even the logics of neoliberal capitalism and the way that it manifests in these landscapes. So I think that there's a very interesting enmeshment with these two logics that produce very similar spatial formations, mainly categorized by increasing inequality, the proliferation of boundaries and borders, and the development of enclave urbanism. What I thought was also really important about this intervention is that it by insisting on the presence of apartheid in the present, it works against the naturalization of inequality that is embedded in the natural landscape. And as somebody who teaches design and planning at Wits University, I think that it's an ongoing conversation, and there has to be an insistence on the durability of these logics in the way that our urban environments are produced. I have another question about land, but I'll leave that for a little bit later. So what I thought was really valuable was precisely about how the sort of supposed post-apartheid moment seemed to herald a new age where all South Africans were suddenly given access to private consumption through physical enclosures, various restrictions and surveillance, but that the emergence of enclave urbanism, or particular recalibration of enclave urbanism in South Africa, also marked a neoliberal socio-economic formation through which urban space has constituted. So you talk a little bit about Oranje, and you also signaled gated communities more generally as instantiations of this recalibration of urban space, but using very similar sort of technologies, zoning technologies, but also how the market becomes a very important reason for entrenching new and also persistent forms of segregation. But what I think is also interesting is the ways in which enclaves form part of the cultural and ideological reconfiguration of the national imaginary, right? So there hasn't been a radical break with this idea of the enclave as a thing that structures how urban space should be proliferated. And I think that I'm wondering about this because you don't use the neoliberal term in your discussion about the new apartheid in explicit terms. You talk about privatization and marketization, which are obviously elements of this. But I think that it's really worth re-emphasizing this assumption that the creation of wealth is sufficient and necessary. It's based on this assumption that the creation of wealth is sufficient and necessary for the improved well-being of the population at large. And that's part of the mythology of, in some ways, the new South Africa, particularly after 1996. It's also based on an assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by freedom of the market. So the role of the neoliberalized state as this kind of distributed entity is to facilitate conditions of profitable capital accumulation, both for domestic and foreign capital, and that it embodies the freedoms that protect the interests of private property owners, of business, of multinational corporations, and financial capital. And also, the chapter was really interesting in that it showed how this kind of this market logic ensured increasing social inequality, and that it is a project which aims to achieve and redefine class power through the concentration of income and wealth in the economic elite. So within this paradigm, freedom becomes an advocacy for free enterprise for the wealthy, with very little freedom for the people who remain poor and are increasingly impoverished. As a result, the results and protection associated with citizenship are re-articulated within market-based interests. So I think what's important about the work also is the ways in which South Africa, after the formal end of apartheid or legislated apartheid, that it also gives rise to new spatial formations that work so much on like an aesthetic of enjoyment, of pleasure, and that's something that kind of obfuscates our understanding or our reading of the durability of this particular modality of rule. And that even while it makes claims to freedom and community and freedom of choice, these discourses are very limited to an economic elite, and they cannot be fully emancipatory. And in fact, they are articulated with rationalities of selective development, and they create zones of exclusion. And that these landscapes constitute the recodification of social difference and are produced through different forms of enclavism. And that these enclaves deterritorialize identities through multiple networks of transactions and produce a segmented social and physical geography. So the process of urban fragmentation is actually ongoing, which speaks to the durability of apartheid and its spatial logics of fragmentation, but that this fragmentation is also supported and continues to be supported by premium infrastructure, which is used to link networks within and beyond the city. So there's a way in which this new geography is also linked into global re-articulations of South Africa, with re-articulation of South Africa within a global economy and global logics of space. That produce what other scholars in the North have described as splintering urbanism, which is characterized by physical growth of metropolitan regions, privatization of public space, the unbundling of services and infrastructure, and increased proliferalization. So I think that there's a lot of work that this opens up in terms of really thinking through this relationship between basically the aesthetics of freedom, right? Which is what is offered to us as there's the aesthetics of freedom, and then there's the material conditions through which these kinds of aesthetics are produced that work through different kinds of things, whether it's selective amnesia, aestheticization, nostalgia, that is propagated through the built environment. So in some ways, the physical environment often actually works to negate a remembering of this history by trying to make us imagine an elsewhere. So there's a way in which the aesthetics work in conjunction with these kinds of spatial politics as part of the work of invisibilization, which I think could enrich the thinking further as part of an ongoing project. But they provide the material basis for contradictory, fractal, and unequal forms of citizenship, and that the confluence of citizenship regimes and class formation has the effect of not only graduated or variegated sovereignty, but also the emergence of new political and material spaces in the city. So I think that so that's really what your chapter of space had me thinking about. And then there's more I could say about ruination and durability, thinking through Vajanthi Rao and Laura Ann Stoller. But what I really wanted to ask you about, and it's something you can choose to return to or not, is you talk very eloquently about what happened in urban spaces, what happened to rural spaces, and the Native Land Act, and all of these questions. But I'm wondering whether the focus on segregation doesn't overlook the larger question of land. And that's something that I think needs to be revisited, so that it's not simply a question of the segregation of the space that exists, but really fundamentally asking questions about racialized dispossession, and that as an ongoing condition that could be articulated a little bit further. Because I think that the language of segregation still pulls us towards the kind of feeling of racial unease, whereas thinking through the question of land dispossession, both in urban spaces and in rural areas, opens up another set of questions. And I think that that is deeply linked into the kind of political futures and spatial futures that we want to imagine. That part of my work is to think through this question of Black spatial futures and Black spatial imaginaries, but it's almost impossible to have that without a new political imagination. So I think that maybe the question of land and thinking through this relationship between segregation and racialized dispossession is something that maybe needs deeper theorization in the spatial discourse. But I really, really appreciate this intervention, and I can see myself assigning it in multiple classes, in multiple contexts, because I mean, you've given guest lectures in my class, but I think it's such a accessible way of understanding a very broad, complex story, but also restating it, and the refusal of this kind of periodization of apartheid in order for us to continue to grapple with it and think through it both conceptually and politically. So I'll leave my comments there. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are in relation to segregation and land. And then finally, in terms of like the other dimensions of apartheid beyond racial segregation, and this question of ruination is the question of like environmental racism, right? That we also have populations that are subjected to ongoing corrosion in terms of their well-being, the prevalence of certain kinds of diseases within historically Black neighborhoods, so that it wasn't simply a question of arable land versus unarable land, or leafy suburbs versus arid townships, but actually about persistent intergenerational exposure of communities to environmental risk, which is another dimension of apartheid landscapes that I think very often gets overlooked because of this kind of larger preoccupation with only race, and not really thinking about its intersections with other aspects that define the human. So yeah, thank you. I'll hand over to, is it Rekgotsofetse or it's to Rekgotsofetse now? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I feel wholly outnumbered by WiSER in this room, completely outnumbered. So I will try my best to represent the Wits School of Governance as the spokesperson for this book. But I mean, Mpho, you just did a fantastic analysis of the space chapter. And I want to commend Sizwe on this book. I think, like Mpho said, I think it's a valuable intervention. And I'm going to talk about a few things and my general thoughts. And Sizwe, you should know I'm definitely going to push you in a few areas. And I'm also going to say something very controversial, so you don't have to say it, that I hope also pushes our conversation forward. So I'll give you that protection, and they can blame me instead. So I mean, I was going to say a whole lot about space, but Mpho's now stolen my thunder, so I don't think I can talk about that anymore. But a really good example of why the new apartheid still exists is the recent unrest that happened in the country. Because if we had really solved out the spatial issues of the apartheid governments that still plague the country till today, what we would find is that that unrest would have spilled completely out of the township areas. It would have completely spilled out of the areas of underdevelopment and would have touched the studio of those who live in Sandton, right? And the fact that you could have, and Stembile kind of talked about this last week, of you could exist in Parkhurst whilst the unrest was happening, and you would have no idea that the country is currently burning at all. And that gives you the clearest sign that apartheid spatial planning is functioning in all it is, in inverted commas, glory, right? So this book gives us an idea of how do you start understanding what this new apartheid looks like. And we have these contemporary examples. But like I said, Mpho stole my thunder for space. I can't go into depth about that. But it's a really good example of why this book is necessary. And the other aspect that I thought was fascinating, and it's just one point that I want to mention that I found interesting in the book, and I think people should read, is this notion of privatizing national liberation. I think that thought process that you embarked on, I think was in your introductory chapter or the law chapter. I thought that was quite interesting about how do you co-opt this notion of national liberation, right? How do you turn this idea of national liberation being for everyone and converting it into something that is just for the few? And I think that is worthy of some people reading. And what I also find interesting is this understanding of privatizing the ANC. So these are the things I'm signposting for people to go off and read, because I found it interesting, of signposting the privatizing of the ANC in particular. But the question it poses of what's the role of a revolving door in the public sector, right? So that idea that you can move from government to the private sector and from the private sector back into government without carrying your baggages of self-interest. And I think the way you unpacked it was really illuminating outside of the State Capture Commission. So those are the things I wanted to signpost around space and the privatizing of national liberation in the ANC. Where I do want to push you, Sizwe, just a little bit, is around the idea of what is the usefulness of democracy in your conception of the new apartheid. So you go at length in the chapter around law about the certain artifacts within our legislations, within our constitution, that help perpetuate this continued existence of apartheid in one way or another. But it really begs the question of what is the point of having a vote at that point, right? The whole idea of having a vote, of allowing the enfranchisement of millions of South Africans, was to say that I can now declare and self-determine the future of this country through some sort of collective vote. And if we know that the general nature of the country, whether through the eyes of gender-based violence, unemployment, inequality, and poverty, so those four critical aspects that really impinge the country, what's the whole purpose of having a democracy at that point if you're unable to use the Constitution for your benefit? And I don't know if changing the words in the Constitution will really do that, right? So Caesar makes a really important point that I didn't know. This is why we must read these types of books. Of the Constitution, if I stand to be corrected, but doesn't use the word apartheid. And if it does, it uses it once, if I'm not mistaken. And it really talks about justice in 4 different occasions. And Caesar does a really good job of deconstructing its use of justice in the preamble, right? Even if we change the words of include apartheid, or be more specific about what we mean about justice, or not talk about non-racialism, but actually talk about being anti-Black, right? And conceptualizing the Constitution around that, I was struggling to figure out whether that would move the needle and whether that would change anything. And it kind of links to the recommendations you make. And I wasn't thinking about that because I wanted to be contrary to you in any particular way. It's because you used the particular word at the beginning of your book. And you then didn't go back to it. So I've got the book, so those who haven't seen it, this is the book. And you use the word, now it's one of those words, I use it in my own research, but I hesitate to say it out loud. So it's on page 12 for those who have it. I've never said this word out loud, so if I butcher it, I apologize. I know what it sounds like in my head, but it's autopoiesis. And the idea of autopoiesis is that it allows us to no longer think about society as we understand certain parts of a whole, right? So if we understand certain parts of a society, we can then understand the whole of it. Because if you deconstruct the whole and you understand the individual parts, you can put that back together and understand what everything looks like. Autopoiesis moves away from that, right? And so I was fascinated by why you chose that word in particular, because I use it in my own research. Because autopoiesis essentially says certain systems are actually self-reproducing. They don't need the whole to inform their individual operations and processes. So when I was reading the book, I was thinking about how do you combat this new apartheid, this entity that I would argue can't actually be broken down to its individual components in the way that I think you've successfully done, but I don't think allows us to really get to the core question and answers that we need. This idea of simply identifying the components and the instruments of the apartheid system and its ongoing legacy, identifying that doesn't help us understand how it keeps self-reproducing over and over and over again. And that's really what autopoiesis really is, about how a particular system can really ignore its external environment, right? So you could change the legislation. I was having this debate, Sizwe, with my supervisor about your book, and who'd been one of my last comments now. You could change the legislative framework of the country. You could change the economic artifacts of the apartheid system, and you could change the social artifacts of the apartheid system, right? You could do all of those activities, but it leaves us in a situation of, but the apartheid system might just self-perpetuate itself. Its logic doesn't change. So when we talk about autopoiesis, it's that idea that the operations of a system, regardless of the external factors that you might change the legislation, change the economic environment, change the social conditions of individuals, but the internal logic of the system stays the same. And that's where I kind of find the new apartheid, but also makes me realize that using the phrasing of new apartheid might actually limit our ability to imagine something outside of it. Because I don't think, and this is my controversial statement, that I can say to protect you, I don't think it is a new apartheid. And I don't think that because I don't want to be limited in the way that I think about the solutions to apartheid itself. Because I think it's something fundamentally different. It might look the same, but it's not. And it's something fundamentally different that we need to now start finding new language as our generation, as we get older, of how we start unpacking this thing, because it seems a bit too easy to just link it to the past. It just feels a bit too easy. And I'm trying to figure out how we go about this in one way or another, because, and this is my last point, because I know I'm way over time here, is at the end of the day, what you don't want to create is, if you make these amendments and you make these changes and these structural changes in one way or another, is that what you're looking for, Caesar, what I imagine you're looking for, some sort of bifurcation point, right? Some sort of tipping point within the system that if you make certain changes to the constitution, to the way we understand democracy, to the way we punish individuals within our society and our conceptualization of all these issues, whether it's technology, space, law, we want to create a bifurcation point in which we diverge from the past. But what you don't want to do is create, what's the phrase, a Feigenbaum constant, right? Where you've created a bifurcation point, but that new path that you've taken will eventually reproduce the old system that you left. And the question is, what are the types of changes that we should be creating? And we could contest, I think, some of them around electoral reform, I think, could create those types of changes. Certain wording in the constitution, I don't think will create those types of changes. But the question I would ask you as my final thing is, what do you think are the types of changes that will create a bifurcation point, so a completely different path of development that doesn't allow us to fall victim to the logic of apartheid again? And what does that look like? Because I don't think, and I might be a downer here, I just don't think it is changing words in the constitution or changing our conceptions of what we think democracy is. And I don't know the answer. I'm not sitting here on my high horse. I don't know what the answer is, and I'm desperately looking for it. But overall, I thought this book was really, really good. I thought some of the chapters were quite interesting. The wealth and technology chapter we must have a conversation about as well. But overall, I think it is something that people should read. And I think it is something that is valuable to the public sphere of the country to heighten our discourse around what we understand the current challenges are in our country. But I'll leave it there. But I'm happy to take other questions from individuals. But if you could answer my questions, I'll be very grateful. Otherwise, you'll get a voice note from me. But I'm going to hand over to Jessica Breakey, who I know also gave a fantastic input as well.
I think you must handle it now, Sizwe, so Khotsi doesn't send you one of his long voice notes. Yeah, they can go on. So I also just want to congratulate you, Sizwe, on this book. And I need to be honest that when I picked it up and the byline, apartheid did not die, it was privatized, I was filled with a little bit of dread. I think I definitely picked it up with apprehension. And this is kind of following our week of unrest in KZN and Gauteng, where we'd just seen this huge battle between the state and the rogue state kind of play out in front of us. I think the last thing I felt like reading was something on the private sector. I mean, I have a friend who told me that a lifetime's worth of think pieces on the ANC, and specifically the KZN ANC, would still not help us understand the twisted, deep contours of the ANC-led South African state. And I must say, I do agree with her. But this book is not that. And I think you actually misled us a bit, because this book is very much about the state. And it does not ignore the role of the state by pivoting entirely to the role of the private sector. And instead, I'll borrow one of your terms that you use, and I'll use it a little bit differently, and say that this book explores the entangled separation of the South African state with the South African private sector. So you write about the role of apartheid creating entangled separation of identities. And in many ways, we see this kind of explosive tension, the simultaneous, forcibly divided and interwoven relationship between these entities. And I think in exploring this entanglement, your book explores and plays with the idea of citizens who are so often only seen as consumers. And I must just say that I do smirk every time your book references the power that lies in shopping malls, because I think we've just seen that idea burn to the ground. So I have a short observation and one prompt that I'd like to quickly explore, time allowing. And all seem to center on life, around life. And it's interesting because Sarah mentioned life in her opening. So, you know, apartheid as a live question, the Constitution as a living document, and in the public life of this book in particular. So the primary intervention that emerges through this book sees apartheid as a live question, right? So you're trying to move away from apartheid simply as an intellectual or political reflection, but a question of today. And I think when exploring this inherited society, you say comparing the past and the present in your introduction, but I say more reflecting of the role of the past in the present, right? Not comparing something that existed and something that now exists, but rather thinking about how what did exist continues to exist. And by doing this, what you call the new apartheid or the neo-apartheid, I think injects new meaning. And one interesting thing I found, and specifically in the chapter of technology, which we have spoken about before, and you hint to it, and I wish you had gone into it a little bit deeper, but you refer to apartheid as an algorithm. And I think that that's an incredibly interesting thing. And for me, as someone who works in tech and in kind of tech justice spaces, I think thinking about, I mean, an algorithm is essentially a way of categorizing people's data and organizing them towards an intended outcome, right? So thinking through apartheid as an algorithm is extremely interesting. And what it does is it demystifies an entire kind of section, people that are talking about tech justice. You know, we're overwhelmed with the newness of it. And I think your take instead positions the struggle against discriminatory tech within the broader struggle for justice. And I think that's a very, very important intervention. And like I said, I wish you had explored it more. But the second intervention that you make is definitely the Constitution. You just move mad in that chapter. And I'm sure that's where you're going to get a lot of heat. But I don't see the call itself to change the Constitution as controversial. And I think, you know, as we debate this, we must understand that the call for reform and the reformation itself are two different debates. And I think, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar and I would never posture as a legal scholar. I'm a sociologist. And so my reading of the Constitution is one that it's a living document, right? It means nothing if its values do not find meaning in the society in which it lives. So if, as you write, the words are not connected to the context, if it's not open to various applications and interpretations, then it's not a transformative document. And in the same way that the language of the Constitution is transformative, I think it can also be transformed by society. And so I believe it's in the interest of a constitutional democracy to have a constitution that is open and ever-changing. And I mean, I think Rekgotsofetse's intervention is interesting because he kind of tied himself in a linguistic knot, right? So the term new apartheid is not useful. So we must not use that term because words carry meaning. But then changing the words of the Constitution will not be useful, even though we know words have meaning. So I thought that was interesting. But I mean, ultimately, the thing that I'm most interested about the book, and I don't want it to come across as rude, is not necessarily the content of the book itself, but the public life of the book. I think that the way this book is written, with what intention and for who, raises very important questions on the role of the public intellectual in South Africa. And I think specifically on the role of the young public intellectual in South Africa. You can tell us what you think this book is not, but we know that the author has very little control over how a text travels and lands and lives in society. And I also think that we know that often how a text is read, interpreted, and critiqued is as important as the text itself, right? And I keep hearing throughout kind of the events this week that this book has taken on a life of its own. And I want to know from you, what does that mean? What does it mean for a text to take on a life of its own, beyond the hashtags, right? What is the public life of this book? What debates will it start? And I think that's where I'm going to end for now. But I will move to Achille, who will be doing the closing comments.
I just want to know, is it now or is Sizwe having an opportunity to answer the comments he has heard?
It is now.
Is now, okay. Look, Sizwe, I will be very brief. You know that I liked your book. I like you. I like the work you are doing. So that's not at all in question. I think that the book is brilliant. It is very well written. It is punchy. It is. It opens up new and extremely fruitful lines of analysis. It also open up, I would say, new directions for future research. And we cannot highlight that strongly enough. I read your book in the midst of the riots, insurrection, whatever name you want to give to that event. I read it, and of all the comments on this event, I was struck in particular by those of the chairperson. He calls himself the chairman. Let's call him the chairperson of the Solidarity Movement. He wrote a piece in Politics Web on July 30th, and the piece was called Think Big, just like yourself, and then make it happen. That was the the title of his piece. In this piece, he was, in fact, raising a very important question, which I think you are raising too. And a very important question which has been with us here in South Africa. In any case, since I moved here, that was 20 or some years ago. And it is the question of the future. Those who will read your book probably will understand that underlying a lot of the reflections you provide is this concern with the present, of course, but even more importantly, with the future, with the question of whether there is still a future in South Africa. And if so, for whom? What kind of future? And if there is no more future in South Africa, then what should be done? In any case, that's how the chairperson of the Solidarity Movement, these are the terms in which he raises this issue. It's an important question because, let's say, 15 or so years ago, it was almost commonsensical to believe that there was a future in South Africa. I mean, Chikane mentioned WiSER. When WiSER was set up, the underlying premise was that there was a future here and there was a future in the continent. And the purpose of the intellectual work was indeed to convene that future, to bring it into existence through intellectual means in particular. So it seems to me that your book is symptomatic of a shift in that temperament, which is both political, cultural, which is also economic, of course. Mpho, Chikane, and Jessica alluded to this. It is typical, let's say, symptomatic of that shift. And this shift itself is opening up a space for new voices. Yours is part of it. Yesterday, we have yesterday voices. I mean, the Mark Gevisers, I don't want to go into Steinberg, number of others. We are witnessing the emergence of new voices, of which yours is of course, extremely important. So I'm mentioning this because the chairperson of Solidarity, he gives three responses to the question of whether or not there is still a future in South Africa. The first response is to say that if there is no future any longer in South Africa, then those who can live should seriously consider living. Where should they go? Where should they move? Not elsewhere in the continent, but overseas, he suggests. So that's his first response. The second response is that if we choose to stay, then we should understand that we won't be able to rely on the state. Jessica mentioned the state. The state, why? Because it is consumed by the slow burn of decay. We should not be relying on the ANC, nor should we rely on the government, because the government, according to him, will not rectify the situation, because both the ANC and the government, in fact, have made it their task to live with the crises rather than resolving them. And therefore, the third solution, and the only solution, according to him, is to, quote him, to create sustainable conditions which will enable us to stay here, but stay here free, safe, and prosperous. by which he basically means if we don't have the choice to move elsewhere, then we should stay here and accept that we won't be able to survive without some form of risk management. That risk management is the new way of life in South Africa for those who cannot move abroad. And he goes on to some extent developing this theory of risk management as a new form of life in the context I have described briefly. Let me just quote him. I think it's better, and then you'll get the gist of two quick quotations. First quotation: people who can afford autonomy do not want to live under the state's rule. And they have long had private medical and private insurance, private security, or they live in private towns. In any case, they want to live in places where the ANC is not in power. So privatization in relation to the question of the state and the question of what form of rule by what dominant political forces. Second quotation: the challenge of our existence lies not in our small numbers, but in our countrywide dispersion as a minority. Therefore, the solution lies in concentrating in places such as community institutions, in places where we are the majority, and there where we could become a sustainable majority. So questions of privatization, of secession, wielded within the ideology of autonomy and diversity and community, all of which, of course, is explained by the necessity to divert more power from above to communities below. I'm just expanding on your concept of apartheid as having been privatized and trying to draw the political consequences or the make a signal in relation to the new political imaginaries that are accompanying, let's say, these observations. And I would like to hear from you about all of this, because it seems to me that the consequences are quite important. When we look at questions of spatial redistribution, almost every other speaker alluded to. We look at ongoing debates on provincial power, case of the Western Cape, the demand, increasing demand to recognize geographical areas for specific communities or groups, your point on Orania in particular. So let me leave all of this at for you. Let me just say that apartheid has not only been privatized, it has also been globalized. It has been so in fact, we thought that it had ended here in South Africa, only to realize that everywhere else it was booming. So it seems to me that it's the tension between privatization and denationalization. It has been denationalized, in fact, that maybe you can play a bit more on that, because it has a future now. And that future, I think Mpho alluded to this, is very much tied to what we have to call, for lack of a better term, neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thanks so much for an incredibly fruitful set of interventions and reflections. yeah, I just can't tell you how exhilarating it is to finally have these kinds of conversations, because this was a particularly lonely project in a particularly lonely moment for all of us, I think. And it's really staggering to hear the various interventions, points of critique and points of affirmation. And so I thank you all. Of course, I'm in the invidious position of having to respond to a set of interventions on which I think I could base the next book. So I will have to limit myself and allow the rest of the conversation and people in the Q&A to also make their intervention. So I'll try to be brief, but I would like to deal with each of the interventions because I think they raise such fundamental questions and such different questions. And so I'll deal with them in order, and just say a few brief things, but also point people to places in the book where if this catches your interest, you might read further. So to come on to Mpho's interventions, the one thing that I'd like to draw out of that, which I think is really important for our conversation here, is the aesthetic of liberation. Your points about apartheid being more than racial unease and the neoliberalization of apartheid space are also crucial. But what really stood out for me is this aestheticization of the liberation moment and how it has become a dividing line in and of itself. And in part, I hadn't thought of that at all, but in part, that was very much what I was trying to say. And I think it's fascinating that in many ways, those who buy into the narrative find themselves on a new dividing line of privilege, where if you buy into that narrative, you can get various access to various networks, access to various forms of freedom, access to various forms of pleasure that were limited before. And so the aestheticization of the liberation moment is something that I think deserves deep future reflection. And I thank you for that. And we'll be thinking about that going forward. To come on to Rekgotsofetse's intervention, again, while I can't touch on everything, the one thing that I do want to mention is this provocation. And I appreciate the challenge, but I think it's unfair because I don't know how we get out of this. And one thing that I do need to make clear is that the proposals that I make about the new republic are not intended to be the solution to the new apartheid. And I do say that that is only a necessary and insufficient step towards uprooting the new apartheid. And there are there are technological, economic dimensions to the new apartheid. And so what I'm trying to do with the constitutional suggestion is just to give a flavor of what it would mean to think differently in this one sphere of how we uproot the new apartheid or apartheid itself. And so I'm not trying to suggest, and I think you're quite right to say that even if we were to inaugurate a new republic, the momentum of what I have tried to describe might still outpace even a new republic. And I think that's in many ways further food for thought, because this is the debate we need to have, and we haven't been having, which is how deep does this go? And how much are we anesthetizing ourselves by ignoring how deeply it goes? And why have we become so addicted to superficial tinkering? You know, for me, what blows my mind, quite frankly, is the public fascination right now with the cabinet reshuffle, which seems to me like the ultimate form of superficial, but we are totally engrossed by just seeing any kind of nominal change, because we're so starved of actually seeing things change around us. And so I have no idea how we uproot the new apartheid, or if it's even possible, certainly in our generation, to do it. But I think this is where the conversation starts. And what I'm really aiming to do is not prognosticate on how we solve it, but I'm trying to describe how deep the problem is. And I think as long as we start from that premise, which is where the premise from which you start, then we can start. And I'm not capable, and no individual is capable of charting the future, but I think we can inaugurate that conversation proper and start to say, okay, that was fun, like the last 3 decades, but what are we really doing? And now let's try and do something different. But I appreciate the provocation, and I'm quite sympathetic to the critique that using apartheid comes with certain dangers, and fair enough. And there's a lot of paradox going on in the title. So what I'm really trying to do is say that there's something very new, but that cannot be dislodged from the old. And I think just as there are dangers of doing that, there are also dangers potentially of pretending that there is something fundamentally new happening, when in fact it actually does trace to historical roots. So how do we gesture towards the new while appreciating the scale of the old? I think that's a key part of what we do. So I appreciate that, and I hope that I have sidestepped long WhatsApp voice notes, but I doubt it. But thank you for the provocation, which is a very important one. Jessica, two things: apartheid as an algorithm and the public life of this book, in addition to many other important interventions. You know, there was a whole section that I cut out where I went on about this, and I think it's there for future work. But I think that analogy is something that we need to develop and think through. What I say in the book is that algorithms are to mental work what machines are to physical work, and so part of the thing that I'm really trying to get at with the new apartheid is that what differentiates this moment from the old moment is that this moment doesn't require personal agency to self-replicate, back to Rekgotsofetse's autopoiesis point. And so we need a way of describing how something can be agentless but nonetheless omnipresent and self-replicating. And so the algorithm, I think, is a useful way of describing that, to the extent that apartheid itself is an algorithm running in the background of society, which may have been switched on at a certain point, but no longer requires an agency to self-perpetuate it, and nonetheless has far-reaching effects. So I hear you on that, and I think this is work that needs to be done post this book in extending and developing that and exploring its intricacies. But I appreciate that observation. The public life of this book is quite, I just don't know how to even describe what it's been like, because watching what happened with the hashtag the new apartheid, I think, is a particularly instructive way of looking at it, because, and it also speaks to some of the digital reflections that I make in the book, to the extent that what starts as a conversation like this at a book launch turns into a very momentary productive conversation on social media using the hashtag and the work, but then slowly becomes about people using the hashtag who don't even know the book exists to promote a message which is linked to various different political agendas. And then eventually it just becomes about people promoting small businesses using the hashtag, which is not even about the conversation. And watching that conversation leave my grasp and morph into something totally beyond my control, which in many ways is counterproductive sometimes to the ambitions of the work, was not something I was fully prepared for, and maybe should have been with this title. Also, the public debate around the book and the way the book has taken on a certain cultural meaning before being read, and is being, you know, sold, hate to say it, but sold at a rate which is quite frightening, is fascinating to me and to my publisher. And I thought I was striking a nerve, but the nerve is much bigger than I realized it was. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is. And so I'm obviously greatly encouraged, but I'm also quite terrified by the digital lives of the book, and also the way that the word is capable of summoning something very, very, something very distressing, but at the same time of great potency in the body politic. And it's been quite the whirlwind and quite the wild ride. And I'm also conscious that very few people have read it yet. And so I'm in this weird moment where the book, people know about the book, but they don't know the book. So it has a public life, but it hasn't got an intellectual life yet, because it's too early for it to be engaged with. And so I'm in a weird liminal moment where people haven't yet been able to engage like we've had engagement tonight, but people know the book exists. Thank you for your various other reflections. And then Achille, yeah, I just have to say, to have you here tonight and even just engaging with the work is beyond my wildest intellectual dreams. And I think you'll see that I've engaged very closely with your work from various generations of that work. And one of the texts that I engaged of yours that I think is crucial and overlooked is a paper you gave at WiSER in 2015 on the futures of apartheid. And there you engage with many of the questions, and I engage quite closely with that work that I'm trying to engage with in assessing the afterlives and the futures of apartheid. And I think when reading that against other versions of your thought and iterations of your work, various interesting things arise in my book where I try to do that. But only you could unite me with the chairperson of the Solidarity Movement in a coherent and rather scary way. And it's funny that you mentioned that op-ed. I haven't read the op-ed, but I did read a speech from this very individual. And again, something I left out of the book and something I wanted to do more in the book that I didn't do was trace this entire privatized network of apartheid power, which is partly AfriForum, is partly the Solidarity Movement being the umbrella for it, but then you've got AfriForum, you've got a whole digital network of media influences on digital spheres, you've got certain political parties, you've got the Freedom Front Plus, and you've got this privatized network of apartheid-inspired political power, which is hell-bent on enclaving and retreating within. And in many ways, this is a new iteration of apartheid logic, to the extent that the project of apartheid was always about how do we stay here but remain separated. And this is the complexity of apartheid that I think we have lost when we consign it to documentaries and benches. And it was this very intricate process of realizing that the external borders of South Africa were pushing all of us together, but we needed to create a series of internal borders to manage the internal separations while we remained together. And this process of simultaneous attraction and repulsion, which is so central to apartheid logics and logics of minority protection and minority control, has gained a new life and has an afterlife in the private sphere, where these entities have a very clear idea of how they want to usurp key aspects of the state in order to maintain and preserve enclaves. The only difference with the enclaves is that they permit a certain degree of Black permeation for reasons of self-preservation, because that nominal Black permeation offsets external criticism, which was one of the main mistakes of the early iterations of apartheid. And so the question, I think, in the late 80s, but even more now, is how can we keep the internal borders, but stave off the external criticism, and at least give the semblance of a certain degree of liberalization? And so looking at these entities, I think is a crucial piece of work that needs to be done to understand the privatization of apartheid state power and how it now works through these various organizations. And I would just add onto that finally that the privatization of the criminal justice system, and this also links to some of Jessica's and Rekgotsofetse's and Mpho's interventions, is a key battleground in that process, because what we've seen is not only the privatization of policing, not only the privatization of access to justice, but also the privatization of the very privatization of prosecution itself. And so when we see AfriForum actually starting to prosecute, we see the breathtaking ambition of that project, which is bearing a certain degree of fruit. Now, obviously, we shouldn't over-dramatize the scale and the power of this initiative, but I think we shouldn't make any mistake about the aims and the goals. And ultimately, I think there is a strain and a strand of that movement which is heading towards an attempt at neo-secession, whereby, for all intents and purposes, while a white Bantustan may not actually be created in practice, it is certainly there in theory, and the borders of that Bantustan are not obvious or advertised, but those who are inside the borders know that they're inside the borders, and those who are outside know they're outside. And so it's fascinating to me that you struck upon the speech, because so much of what is happening at the moment with regards to the privatization of apartheid is in that network. And I think we need to pay a lot more attention to it and the ways in which it reinforces the new apartheid. So certainly, I think there's a lot more to explore there, and to bring out and dig up those parts of the work that I didn't emphasize as much. And then just finally on the global aspects, because I think this also relates obviously to what you said, Achille, but to the spectrum of interventions. From Rekgotsofetse's questioning about democracy, Jessica's and Mpho's reflections on questions of neoliberalism. In many ways, I think what has happened since 1994 is that South Africa has become more like the rest of the world. But at the same time, and unbeknownst, the rest of the world has also become more like South Africa. And so systems of apartheid, once we understand them in their full depth, we can actually find in various iterations in different forms in other parts of the world. And so ironically, what I say in the book is that South Africa is a rare case where history was told by the losers. But in actual fact, while South Africa democratized, the rest of the world learned a lot from the apartheid project in that moment. And so as we were changing, the rest of the world was starting to learn the lessons of apartheid. And that process, I think, is key. And as you say in some of your work, Achille, South Africa has always been a fascinating microcosm for the rest of the world. And I think the new apartheid itself, again, is a fascinating microcosm for global forms of oppression, global forms of neo-oppression. And how does theorizing the new apartheid in this moment bring to bear new insights for questions of racial justice in the US or Europe or Australia or Southern Africa or other parts of the continent? And how can this lens be used usefully and fruitfully to spark a global conversation? And so I'll just end on that with one thing that I say in the book on that question. And I'll leave it at that. South Africa has always been a unique place from which to understand deeper global forces. The new apartheid thus refracts global questions of private power and racial injustice. Apartheid inspired and was inspired by other systems of racial oppression from Germany to Britain and from the US to Australia and Brazil. Likewise, the new apartheid draws from and influences 21st century racial oppression and neo-colonialism. Therefore, if South Africa defeats the new apartheid, it will inspire other nations to contend with white supremacy. If it fails, this will demonstrate white supremacy's resilience. In some ways, South Africa remains a unique experiment in racial injustice. In other ways, it has become more like the rest of the world since 1994. And once again, thank you for interventions, and I look forward to taking any questions if we have time from the floor.
A huge credit to all of you. And there's been an outstanding discussion. You know, and I think it was right just to let it run. We are running out of time. We don't want to lose our audience. We want them to stay. So, I mean, I'd like to put a cap on it, you know, by sort of 7:45, 10 to 8 latest. And I think the way to do it is to offer our 3 respondents a chance for closing comments by looking at the questions in the chat, the comments, drawing on any of them. If people are asking you directly, please respond. So it's a big ask to speak briefly, but please let's close with your comments and then we'll end the session. Thanks. Mpho, we'll start with you.
My question is unrelated to space, and it's more about how, in what ways has race been reconstituted in the new apartheid? I think that's a question that I'd like to have more clarity on and maybe read the book more closely. And I agree fully with Achille, actually, that apartheid has been globalized. So I think that there's a slight conceptual difference between saying South Africa has become more like the rest of the world. I think South Africa precedes it. I think apartheid precedes neoliberal landscapes, and that the logic of apartheid space is something that has the capacity to proliferate. And I think understanding that logic in its many articulations is definitely worth unpacking. But thank you again, Sizwe, for your responses. And also it's aesthetics, right? So the things that it hides from us. So thanks. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Rekgotsofetse?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was only one question that I kind of picked up from Josie that I did answer in the chat, but I think if we understand this neo-apartheid as some sort of emergent phenomenon, I think it's hugely important. I think it moves the conversation forward. And emergence here is that it can't simply be broken down to its individual components. right? So simply understanding the mechanisms of the apartheid system, simply understanding the legislation doesn't allow you to understand its ongoing impact because it's greater than that. So I think if we were to use the language of the new apartheid, I think thinking of it through the lens of emergence becomes hugely important. And just there was one comment around the role of the public intellectual. I think there's a huge responsibility on the new generation of public intellectuals around how we don't regurgitate arguments of the past as a simple academic exercise. I think, so I completely agree with Jessica's comments, that there's a huge responsibility on our shoulders of how can we take the arguments of the past and create solutions for the future. And it is fine if we don't know. Sizwe, I don't know how to solve the country's problems. I've got my ideas. You and I both know if someone gives us 100 million rand, we can make a plan. But I think it is hugely important that those who are in the public sphere can think beyond the past discourse and give the normal citizen, normal is a horrible way to describe it, but give the everyday citizen who's in the public sphere new discourse and new language to understand the problems of our present. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, and thank you. And I agree with Rekgotsofetse about, the role of the public intellectual or the young public intellectual. And I think, what this book does also is show us how many different publics there are, right? And so who are we speaking to when we have so many different publics is also is a really interesting question. But Sizwe, I think something you said about the algorithm is just really interesting for me right now, and it's going to be my last thing, but I had not at all thought about apartheid as a black box algorithm until your and Rekgotsofetse's conversation about kind of how we don't understand the inner logics and it perpetuates without us knowing. I had really thought of it as quite a planned, organized, an algorithm curated from data and not as something that's running in the background without us being aware of it. And I think that is something that I'm going to be thinking about a lot, actually. So thank you very, very much, both of you, for that intervention.
Thank you very much to everybody. I'm sorry there hasn't been more time to engage with the chat, but that's nevertheless the way the session unfolded. And thank you to everyone for being here and for posing those questions and posting those comments. Sizwe, the caliber of response is a measure of respect for the book that you've written. It's been an absolute pleasure engaging with you this evening. And thank you all. Have a good evening. And what a pleasure. Thanks. Bye.